My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 72 years old, and 3 days after returning from a weekend trip, I found my entire life packed into cardboard boxes on the porch of the home I had lived in for 40 years. The note from my son's girlfriend, taped to my favorite armchair, said simply, "We needed the space." But it was their next move, a vicious legal attack to declare me mentally incompetent, that truly showed me what they were capable of. Their faces in that courtroom when they realized they hadn't just underestimated me, but that they had awakened a part of me I thought had died with my husband? That's a memory I will treasure forever. It's just past dawn here in Port Blossom, and the fog is rolling in from the harbor. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Let me know in the comments. For now, let me tell you how it all happened. The air had been still when I'd left 3 days prior. It was the kind of heavy, humid quiet that precedes a summer thunderstorm. The air so thick you can almost taste the salt and the coming rain. I had driven down the coast to visit my old university roommate, Sarah, for a brief respite from the summer heat and the quiet house. There had been no fight, no argument. Julian had even hugged me by the car, a quick, almost perfunctory embrace that felt more like a duty than an expression of love. "Drive safe, Mom," he'd said, his eyes already drifting back toward the house where his girlfriend, Chloe, stood on the porch, waving with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd promised to water the hydrangeas. But as I stepped from the taxi onto the cobblestone driveway 3 days later, a deep wrongness permeated the air. The warmth of the setting sun did little to chase away the chill that had nothing to do with the evening mist. The warm yellow light of the porch lamp, a beacon I'd always looked for when returning home, was extinguished. The grand bay windows, which usually glowed with life, were dark, like vacant eyes staring out into the twilight. And then I saw it. The carnage. It wasn't a scene of violence, not in the traditional sense. It was something far more methodical, more surgical in its cruelty. My life, or what felt like it, was packed into a series of cardboard coffins stacked neatly on the porch. My suitcase, a worn leather companion whose scuffs and scratches told the story of a lifetime of travel with my late husband Arthur, sat beside a stack of plastic storage bins. On top lay a hand-stitched quilt I had made the year Julian was born, its edges frayed with time and countless bedtime stories. My reading lamp, its brass neck slightly bent from years of use, lay on its side. Next to it, 2 framed photographs. One of Arthur, his smile forever young and captured in a moment of seaside joy. The other was of the 3 of us on Julian's first day of kindergarten. Me and Arthur beaming, Julian a small, gap-toothed boy clutching his lunchbox. The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight, but the scent. A sharp, cloying perfume. Chloe's signature scent drenched the air. It clung to my favorite armchair, which had been dragged out and left in the damp evening air, its velvet upholstery already feeling sodden to the touch. Taped to its back was a single, pristine white envelope. But it was the object shattered at my feet that truly stole my breath. The porcelain music box Arthur had given me on our first anniversary. Its delicate ballerina, once pirouetting to a tinkling melody, was snapped at the waist. Her tiny, silent scream seemed to echo my own. I bent down, my fingers tracing the sharp, broken edges of the porcelain. It was a clean break, as if done with a single, decisive blow. With trembling hands, I peeled the envelope from the armchair. Inside, on a piece of torn notebook paper, were 6 words written in Chloe's elegant, looping script. "We needed the space. It's done." No warning, no final argument. Just a quiet, surgical erasure. In that moment, as the fog rolled in from the harbor and settled like a shroud over the manicured lawns of Port Blossom, I realized something deeper than betrayal had occurred. This wasn't just about being pushed out of the Victorian seaside home where I had raised my son. It was about being replaced. My entire existence, my memories, my possessions, my very presence had been deemed an inconvenience, a piece of clutter to be discarded without a second thought. I stood there for a long while, the cold seeping through the thin soles of my shoes. I didn't cry. The shock was a crystalline thing, too sharp and clear for tears. I didn't knock on the door I still legally owned. What was there to say? The lock had been changed. The message was clear. A car drove by, its headlights cutting through the thickening fog, and for a moment it illuminated the drawn curtains of the living room. No one parted them to watch me go. The silence was deafening, more deafening than any shouting match could ever be. My mind, trained by 40 years of assessing legal and financial risk for an insurance firm, started to kick into gear, pushing past the initial wave of grief. This wasn't just impulsive cruelty. This was calculated. The neatness of the boxes, the finality of the note, it was an execution. I carefully lifted my suitcase. I opened it, tucked the unbroken photo of Arthur inside, and folded the precious quilt, placing it on top. I walked away from that door without looking back, my footsteps swallowed in the fog. This wasn't just an eviction. It was a declaration of war. And as I reached the corner of the street where the old gas lamps began to flicker on, I knew my first move wasn't to find a friend or to break down in tears. It was to find a safe, neutral space. A hotel. I needed to think. I needed to assess the damage. My training told me that in the face of a catastrophic event, the first step is to secure your position before you plan your counteroffensive. And I had every intention of planning one. The hotel was a generic, anonymous place downtown, the kind with beige walls and art so bland it was offensive. It was perfect. It was a space devoid of memory, a sterile environment where I could begin to dissect the situation without the ghosts of my past life whispering in my ear. I checked in under my own name, paid for 3 nights with my credit card, and locked the door behind me. The silence in the room was different from the silence at the house. This was an empty silence, a blank slate. The other had been a weaponized silence, heavy with unspoken condemnation. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced, replaying the scene on the porch, the shattered ballerina, the looping script of Chloe's note. But underneath the hurt, a cold, analytical anger was beginning to form. This wasn't just Chloe. Julian was my son. He had stood there, hugged me, and watched me drive away knowing what was planned. He had chosen comfort over character. He had outsourced my eviction to the woman who now slept in my bed.
The next morning, after a sleepless night fueled by lukewarm hotel coffee, I knew my first priority. It wasn't my clothes or my furniture. It was my identity, my legal standing. My most important documents, the original deed to the house, Arthur's will, our investment portfolios, my birth certificate, were all kept in a safe deposit box at Port Blossom Savings and Loan, the same bank Arthur and I had used for decades. I remembered, with a chilling clarity that made the hairs on my arms stand up, a conversation from about 6 months ago. Julian had sat with me in the kitchen, looking over some of my mail. "Mom, he'd said, his tone casual, "you should really put me as a co-signer on your safe deposit box, just in case of an emergency. What if something happened to you? It would be a nightmare for me to get access." At the time, it had sounded responsible, like the caring concern of a loving son. I had gone to the bank with him the following week and signed the papers. The bank was a familiar, solid building of granite and brass. The cool, quiet air inside did little to calm the frantic beating of my heart. I walked up to the counter, my hands steady despite the tremor I felt inside. "I'd like to access my safe deposit box, please," I said to the young teller. She gave me a polite, professional smile. I signed the access card, my signature firm, and she compared it to the one on file. She led me into the vault, the massive steel door swinging open with a satisfying thud. The air inside was cold and still. She pulled out the long metal box, number 314, and placed it on the table in the small private viewing room before closing the door behind her. For a moment, I just stared at it. This box contained the legal framework of my life. With a deep breath, I inserted the key. It turned smoothly. I lifted the heavy lid. It was empty. The breath I was holding escaped in a ragged gasp. It was utterly, completely empty. The velvet lining at the bottom was pristine, untouched. The deed, the will, the stock certificates, everything. Gone. I sank into the small chair, the polished wood cold against my back. It was a physical blow, as if the air had been punched from my lungs. This was their masterstroke. They hadn't just thrown my belongings onto the porch, they had systematically stripped me of my legal foundation. They had taken my past and my proof of ownership, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a credit card. I walked out of the vault in a daze. The teller at the counter saw my face, and her professional smile faltered. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Vance?" My voice, when I found it, was hoarse. "Can you tell me the last time this box was accessed?" She tapped a few keys on her computer. Her eyes widened slightly. "It was accessed yesterday morning by Mr. Julian Vance." Of course. The day after I left, he had used the key he'd kept for safekeeping and emptied it. At that moment, I understood. This was not a plan to simply get more space. This was a hostile takeover of my life. They were trying to erase me, not just from the house, but from the public record. Without the deed, proving ownership would be a nightmare. Without the will, their actions could be painted as a necessity. They were creating a new reality, one in which I was a non-entity. I walked out of the vault in a daze. The bright morning sun felt a profound, chilling sense of violation. I thought of Arthur, of how meticulously he had planned everything to ensure I would be secure after he was gone. He had arranged our finances, the house, the inheritance, to be ironclad. He just never anticipated the threat would come from the inside. He never imagined our own son would be the one to dismantle it all. The shock was finally beginning to recede, replaced by a slow-burning heat. This was no longer just about a house. This was about my name, my legacy, my right to exist. They had made a critical error. They had assumed my age meant I was weak. They had mistaken my love for Julian as a weakness they could exploit. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I may have been a grieving widow, a quiet mother, but I had also spent 40 years reading the fine print of life, and I knew that every contract, every agreement has a loophole, and every act of deceit leaves a paper trail. My new job was to find it. My mind was a whirlwind of legal statutes and what-if scenarios, a chaotic library of my years as a legal insurance underwriter. I needed to find a quiet place to think, to lay out the facts without the suffocating walls of the hotel room. I ended up at the public library, not for the books, but for the anonymity and the free Wi-Fi. I found a secluded carrel in the back and took out a small notebook from my purse. On the first page, I wrote, "Hostile takeover of Vance Estate." I drew a line down the middle. On one side, their assets, and on the other, my assets. Their side was alarmingly full. My house, my furniture, my original documents, Julian's position as my son, and their youth. My side was terrifyingly short. My name, my credit card, my mind, and my professional history. It wasn't a fair fight. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally, but not just a friend to cry with. I needed someone with specific knowledge, someone who understood the brutal landscape of family legal battles. And then a name surfaced from the depths of my memory: Isabel Rosie. Isabel and I started at the same insurance firm in our 20s. We were two of the only women in a sea of men in gray suits. She was sharp, pragmatic, the kind of woman who read the fine print of life and never missed a detail. While I had retired to raise Julian and manage our family life, Isabel had climbed the corporate ladder. We'd lost touch after Arthur's funeral, but I remember hearing she had left the firm to start her own consulting business. Finding her was surprisingly easy. A quick search for Isabel Rosie Consulting brought up a sleek professional website. Her firm specialized in navigating complex family legal and financial disputes. It was as if fate had handed me a lifeline. Her office was right here in Part Blossom. I called the number. When her assistant answered, I simply said, "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm an old friend of Isabel's. Please tell her it's urgent." Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang. "Eleanor." Isabel's voice was exactly as I remembered. Brisk, no nonsense, but with an undercurrent of warmth. "What's wrong?" "Isabel," I said, my voice cracking for the first time, "I need your help." We met an hour later at a small cafe near her office. When she saw me, her professional demeanor melted away and she wrapped me in a hug. "Good Lord, Eleanor, you look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," I replied, sitting down. "My own."
I laid out the story, from the boxes on the porch to the empty safe deposit box. I kept my tone even, presenting the facts as I would have presented a case file years ago. Isabel listened intently, her expression hardening with every word. She didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts. She just listened. When I finished, she was silent for a moment, stirring her coffee. Then she said something that made the blood run cold in my veins. "This isn't a surprise to me." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "About a month ago," she began, her eyes locking onto mine, "I was at a local business mixer. Chloe was there. She manages that high-end wellness spa downtown, and she was networking. A mutual acquaintance introduced us. She was effusive, talking about their big plans. She mentioned they were looking to invest in a new development, and that it would be possible once they liquidated some family assets. She specifically talked about unlocking the potential in your house." There it was. Concrete proof of premeditation. It wasn't just a sudden impulse. It was a campaign. Isabel leaned forward. "Eleanor, this is a classic playbook for financial elder abuse. They isolate, they gain control of assets, and then they act. What about your mail, your bills?" A sick feeling washed over me as more puzzle pieces clicked into place. "Chloe offered to help me with the household accounts a few months back," I admitted, the memory making me feel foolish. "She said I shouldn't have to worry about things like property tax notices and utility bills. She set up online accounts for everything, using her email address." Isabel's face was grim. "She's been intercepting your mail. She's been building a file on you, creating a paper trail that makes it look like she's the one managing your affairs. We need to see what she's done." She pulled out her laptop right there in the cafe. "What was the name of the utility company?" I told her. Using the library's Wi-Fi, Isabel logged into the public portal of the utility company. Because I still knew my own account number and social security information, we were able to access the records. And there it was. Under the account documents section, a PDF copy of a utility transfer request, dated 2 weeks prior. It requested that the name on the account be changed from Eleanor Vance to Chloe Renaud. And at the bottom, in the authorization box, was a signature. It was a clumsy, almost insulting forgery of my own. I stared at the screen, at the ghost of my name, so easily faked, so casually discarded. They were already replacing me on paper, as if I had never existed. "They're trying to build a case that you're not competent, that they're managing your life," Isabel said quietly. "They'll use this to legitimize a sale or a loan." The shock and grief were now completely gone, burned away by a cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't a family squabble over an inheritance. This was fraud. Isabel closed her laptop. "You need more than a consultant, Eleanor. You need a shark, and I know just the one." The name Isabel gave me was Silas Croft. "He's semi-retired," she explained as we walked out of the cafe, "which means he only takes cases that interest him. He's known for being unorthodox, but he's brutally effective. He doesn't just read contracts. He reads people." Silas Croft's office was not in a sterile downtown high-rise. It was in a restored captain's house overlooking the sea, a place of old wood and history, much like my own home. A brass plaque by the door simply said, "S. Croft, Attorney at Law." There was a quiet dignity to the place that felt reassuring. I had called ahead, and his assistant, a calm woman with a kind face, had told me Mr. Croft could see me for a preliminary consultation. She had warned me, "Mr. Croft's time is valuable. Please be prepared." I was prepared. Mr. Croft was older than me, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to see everything.
He greeted me not with a handshake, but with a calm nod, and led me into a room lined with books from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the sea. He gestured for me to sit in a leather armchair that faced his large, mahogany desk. He sat opposite me, folded his hands, and said nothing. He just waited. I didn't begin with the story of the boxes or the shattered music box. I didn't speak of my grief for my shock. I took out my notebook and placed it on his desk, open to the page where I had begun my analysis. I presented the facts as I knew them, my voice even and steady. 3 days ago, I was illegally evicted from my primary residence at 142 Ocean Drive, of which I am the sole legal owner. The perpetrators are my son Julian Vance and his partner Chloe Renaud. They have since taken possession of the property and its contents. Yesterday morning, my safe deposit box at Port Blossom Savings and Loan was emptied of all legal documents, including the original deed to the property and my late husband's will. The access was made by my son, who is a co-signer on the box. I continued, laying out the timeline, the conversation with Isabel, the discovery of the forged utility transfer request. I pushed my laptop toward him, showing him the PDF of the forged signature. Ms. Renaud's actions constitute fraud. They are building a paper trail to establish a false narrative of my incompetence, likely as groundwork for a forced sale of the property or to secure a line of credit against it. I finally looked up and met his gaze. I spent 40 years as a legal insurance underwriter. My job was to assess the validity and risk of complex legal claims. I am not here today as a grieving mother, though I am that. I am here as a victim of a coordinated campaign of fraud, and I am looking to retain counsel to restore my property and protect my assets. For the first time, a flicker of interest appeared in his eyes. He picked up my notebook and read my notes, his focus absolute. Then he looked at the forged document on the screen. He was silent for a long time, so long that I began to think he was going to refuse. Finally, he spoke, his voice even and deep. They made a classic mistake. They got greedy and they got sloppy. The forgery is amateurish. The safe deposit box is a clear act of theft. But none of this changes the fundamental fact: you are the sole legal owner of that house. He leaned back in his chair. You are correct in your assessment. This is groundwork for fraud. So, Mrs. Vance, what is it you want? I want my home back, and I want to ensure they can never touch another thing that belongs to me. Restoration and fortification, he muzzed. That can be done. But it will be a fight. They will likely get uglier before this is over. Are you prepared for that? Mr. Croft, I replied, my voice hard as steel. They left my life on a porch to be rained on. They smashed a gift from my dead husband. I am prepared for anything. A slow, thin smile touched his lips. Very well, Mrs. Vance. I'm interested. He named his retainer fee. It was steep, enough for me to catch my breath, but I had enough in my checking account to cover it. It would be a significant portion of my liquid assets, but it was a necessary investment.
He then walked me through the first steps of his strategy, a quiet fortification. We will not engage them directly, not yet. We act through official channels. First, a formal cease and desist letter delivered by courier to their respective workplaces. It will inform them that they are illegally occupying your property and must vacate immediately. It puts them on formal notice. Second, he continued, I will file a protective memorandum with the county clerk's office, flagging the property against any unauthorized transactions. Any attempt to sell it or borrow against it will be instantly blocked and reported. Third, a notification to the local real estate board alerting them that any listing for that property not originating from you with notarized proof of identity is to be considered fraudulent. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive plan. It was a wall, being built brick by brick around my life, a wall they wouldn't even see until they ran straight into it. "And the safe deposit box?" I asked. "That," he said, his eyes glinting, "is our ace in the hole. For now, we let them think they have it." I signed the engagement letter and wrote the check for his retainer with a hand that did not shake. As I left his office, the sea air felt different. It was still cold, but it felt clean, bracing. I had an ally. I had a plan. The shock had been replaced by resolve. The game was afoot. The next 2 days were a blur of quiet, methodical action. While Silas Croft and his team prepared the legal documents, I followed his advice and continued to build my own case. I spent hours at the library, using their computers to access my online credit card statements and bank records. A cold dread snaked through me as I saw a pattern of small, insidious purchases I hadn't made. A subscription to a high-end architecture magazine, a payment to a credit monitoring service under Julian's name. Small things, but together they painted a picture of him and Chloe slowly weaving their financial lives into mine, like vines choking a tree. I also made a difficult call to my old roommate, Sarah, the one I had just visited. I didn't tell her everything. It was too raw, too humiliating. But I told her there was a serious family issue and asked if she remembered any conversations we'd had about Julian's finances. Her reply was hesitant, but telling. "Well, Eleanor, I didn't want to say anything, but Julian called me about a month ago. He said he was helping you manage your estate and needed a general idea of your assets for tax planning. I thought it was a bit odd, but he's your son." He had been polling my friends, trying to assess the value of his prize. On Wednesday afternoon, the first volley was fired. Couriers delivered sealed, waterproof envelopes to Julian's office at the investment firm downtown and to the front desk of the Bliss Wellness Spa that Chloe managed. I pictured the scene in my mind, the disruption, the confusion, the cold legal language of the cease and desist letter. The reaction was immediate. At 4:15 p.m., my phone flashed with Julian's name. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. He called back immediately. I let it ring again. And again. 5, 6 times. Then, a text message from Chloe. Short and sharp. "You didn't have to do this." I stared at the words, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. I didn't have to do this? They had rendered me homeless, stolen my legal identity, and shattered my most precious memories, but I was the one escalating things? I didn't reply. Silence, I was learning, was a far more powerful weapon than anger. That evening, I was eating a bland salad in my hotel room when a knock came at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Julian. He looked tired, confused, and more than a little angry. I opened the door, but I didn't move. I stood in the doorway, blocking his entry. "What do you want, Julian?" "Can we talk, Mom?" he pleaded, his eyes not meeting mine. "This is a huge misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. My life, packed in boxes on the porch, was a misunderstanding? My empty safe deposit box was a misunderstanding? "I can explain it," he said, trying to push past me. I held my ground. "Explain it from there." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Chloe got a little ahead of herself. She thought you were getting frail, that you weren't managing things well. She was just trying to help, to take the burden off you. It was never supposed to go this far." Lies layered on top of half-truths. I listened without interruption, my face a mask of stone. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. "Why didn't you stop her?" He looked at the floor, the picture of a man cornered by his own cowardice. "Because I didn't want the conflict," he mumbled. "It felt easier to let her handle it. I didn't think you'd push back." He hadn't chosen her over me. He had chosen comfort over character. And that, I realized, was the deepest betrayal of all. I had raised a son who would trade his mother's dignity for a quiet evening. "You need to leave, Julian," I said flatly. Just as he was turning to go, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Silas. The subject line was, "Urgent." I closed the door on my son's crestfallen face and opened the email. My blood ran cold. But it wasn't an email from Silas. It was a forwarded email chain. The original message was from a law firm I didn't recognize, addressed to Julian and Chloe. Attached was a legal filing. I clicked it open. Petition for emergency temporary conservatorship of the person and estate of Eleanor Vance. My breath hitched. They hadn't just fought back, they had launched a nuclear attack. The document was filled with legal jargon, but the message was brutally clear. It was an application to have me declared mentally incompetent. The petition was filled with twisted truths and outright lies. My sudden disappearance to a hotel was cited as proof of erratic behavior. My neglect of the property was mentioned. They even included a statement from a concerned neighbor who had seen me looking disoriented on the day I returned. They had twisted my shock and grief into a symptom of dementia. And at the bottom was a request for the court to grant them, Julian and Chloe, full legal control over my finances, my property, and my medical decisions. A judge had signed a temporary order freezing my main bank accounts pending a hearing in 2 weeks. They weren't just trying to take my house, they were trying to take my mind, my freedom, my very self. They were trying to put me in a legal cage. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. This was a battle I hadn't anticipated. They were smarter and more ruthless than I had imagined. This wasn't a fight for a house anymore. This was a fight for my life. The fear was a physical thing, a block of ice forming in my chest. They had outmaneuvered me. While I was building a defensive wall, they had tunneled underneath it and attacked from behind. The temporary freeze on my accounts meant the check I had written for Silas's retainer would bounce. I was suddenly financially crippled, legally besieged, and fighting for my own sanity.
I called Silas immediately, my voice tight with panic. "They filed for a conservatorship. They've frozen my accounts." There was no hint of alarm in his voice. "I see. A bold move. Desperate, but bold. Don't worry about my fee for now, Mrs. Vance. This just changed the nature of the game. They've escalated from a property dispute to an attempt to strip you of your civil liberties. The court will not look kindly on that if we can prove malice." "If," I echoed, the word tasting like ash. "How can we prove it when they're painting me as a confused old woman?" "We fight on 2 fronts," he said, his voice a calming anchor in my storm of fear. "Front 1, we aggressively fight the conservatorship. Front 2, we continue to gather evidence of their fraud. They think they've put you on the defensive. We will use their attack to expose their motives." He then gave me a piece of advice that would become my mantra for the next 2 weeks. "They are attacking your competence, Eleanor. The single best defense is to be overwhelmingly, undeniably competent. I will handle the legal filings. Your job is to build a testament to your life. Show me who you are." His words ignited a spark in the cold darkness of my fear. He was right. This wasn't just about legal tactics anymore. This was about the narrative. They had written a story in which I was the frail, confused victim. I would have to write a better one, a truer one. The next morning, I did not go back to the library to hide. I walked into the local branch of my bank, the one where my accounts were now frozen. I walked straight to the branch manager, a woman I had known for years. I calmly explained the situation, that a fraudulent conservatorship claim had been filed against me by my son. I showed her the letter from Silas Croft. I asked for a complete printout of all my account activities for the past year. I was polite, firm, and lucid. I was performing competence. My days fell into a new routine.
I spent my mornings at the library, not just aimlessly searching, but working. I was a researcher again. I requested copies of my own property tax payments going back 10 years, proving a flawless record of financial responsibility. I found digital copies of the elaborate travel itineraries I had planned for myself and Arthur, demonstrating my organizational skills. I even found old emails I had sent to our financial advisor, discussing investment strategies with a clarity that belied their claims of my confusion. Silas had given me a task, a piece of homework. He'd said, "Write your biography." Not the story of your life, but the biography of your responsibilities. Every mortgage you paid, every insurance policy you managed, every investment you tracked, every time you balanced a checkbook. So I wrote. I sat in that quiet library and filled a notebook. I wrote about how I managed the budget for the extensive renovation of our kitchen in '98. I wrote about navigating the labyrinthine medical bills during Arthur's final illness. I wrote about how I had meticulously managed the college fund that paid for Julian's education, the very education that now enabled him to sit in an investment firm and plot against me. Each memory, each task was a brick in the wall of my defense. It was a painful process, reliving a life of care and responsibility only to see it weaponized against me. But with every page, my resolve hardened. I also made calls. I reconnected with old friends and former colleagues, people who hadn't heard from me in years. I didn't ask them for pity. I asked for something more valuable, their testimony. I asked if they would be willing to write a letter to the court attesting to my character, my intelligence, my sharpness of mind. The response was overwhelming. Letters began to pour into Silas's office, a chorus of voices speaking to my competence. One afternoon, Isabel called. "I have something," she said, her voice tense. "A friend of mine works in the mortgage industry. I asked her to do a quiet search, see if any applications had been filed for your address. She found one." "The home equity line of credit," I said, my heart pounding. "Yes," Isabel confirmed, "but here's the kicker, Eleanor. It was rejected. The loan officer flagged the signature on your driver's license as inconsistent with other documents they had on file. They suspected fraud." This was it. This was the smoking gun. They hadn't just attempted fraud, they had been caught. Their failure was now our greatest weapon. As the hearing date approached, the fear that once paralyzed me was gone, replaced by a cold, coiled readiness. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They had no idea that they had inadvertently given me a platform. They wanted to put my life on trial. I would give them a trial they would never forget. I had my story, I had my evidence, and I had a chorus of witnesses. The two-front war was about to converge into a single, decisive battle. The morning of the hearing was gray and overcast, the sky the color of slate. The weather seemed to match the cold knot of anxiety in my stomach. This was it. This was the day my life, my mind, and my freedom would be put on trial. I met Silas in the lobby of the Port Blossom County Courthouse. The building was old and imposing, with marble floors that echoed with every footstep, and high ceilings that seemed to swallow sound. It was designed to make you feel small, insignificant. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and refused to be intimidated. I had chosen my outfit with care, a simple, dark blue dress, professional and understated. No hint of a frail, confused old woman. I was dressed for business. "Ready?" Silas asked, his eyes searching my face. "As I'll ever be," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Remember," he said, placing a reassuring hand on my arm for a moment, "they have the burden of proof. They have to convince the judge that you are incapable. We just have to show the judge who you truly are. Let their lies collapse under the weight of the truth." Our hearing was not in a grand open courtroom, but in a judge's chambers. It was a smaller, more intimate setting, which somehow made it feel even more intense. The room was paneled in dark wood, dominated by a large desk where the judge sat, and a long table for the opposing parties. We entered the room. Julian and Chloe were already there, sitting on one side of the table with their lawyer, a a slick-looking man in a suit that was too expensive. Chloe gave me a small, pitying smile, as if I were a lost child she was trying to help. Julian wouldn't look at me. He stared at a fixed point on the wall, his jaw tight. He looked haggard, the strain of his deception etched onto his face. He was a man drowning in his own choices. The judge, a named Eleanor Hasham, a strange coincidence that felt like a small omen, was in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the file in front of her, her expression unreadable. This is the matter of the emergency petition for conservatorship of Eleanor Vance, filed by her son, Mr. Julian Vance, and his partner, Miss Choli Renault. I have read the petition and the initial declarations. Counsel for the petitioners, you may begin.
Their lawyer stood up. He spoke in a smooth, sympathetic tone, painting a picture of a beloved mother descending into the fog of dementia. He described my erratic behavior, my confusion, my inability to manage my own affairs. He spoke of Julian's heartbreak at having to take this drastic step, framing the entire proceeding as an act of love, a painful necessity. Your Honor, he concluded, my clients are here today to protect Eleanor from herself. It was a masterful performance, filled with concern and sorrow. I could feel the narrative taking hold, the story they had so carefully constructed. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, and listened to them describe a stranger, a feeble-minded ghost who bore my name. The lawyer then called his first witness. I call Mr. Julian Vance to the stand. Julian walked to the witness chair, his steps heavy. He was sworn in, and their lawyer began to question him. Mr. Vance, the lawyer began gently, could you please describe your mother's behavior in recent months? Julian cleared his throat. She's been different, more forgetful. She misplaces things. Sometimes she seems distant, confused about dates. And was there a specific incident that caused you to file this petition? Yes, Julian said, his voice dropping. She recently left for a weekend trip without telling us where she was going. When she came back, she didn't come home. She checked into a hotel. We were terrified. We thought she was lost. It was the final straw. We realized she couldn't be left on her own anymore. Lie after lie, each one a careful twist of the truth. I had told him exactly where I was going. I had checked into a hotel because he had thrown me out of my own home. My hands clenched in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. I forced myself to breathe, to remain calm. My turn would come. For now, I just had to endure the fiction. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the first act of their tragedy was underway. I could only pray that the final act would be mine. Julian continued his testimony, guided by the gentle, leading questions of his lawyer. He painted a portrait of a woman slowly losing her grip, a loving son forced into an agonizing position. He spoke of the untouched mail and unpaid bills, carefully omitting that Chloe had taken over the accounts precisely to create that illusion. He spoke of his concern for the upkeep of the house, implying I had let it fall into disrepair. Each word was a betrayal, a small, sharp cut. When his lawyer was finished, Judge Hisham turned to Silas. Mr. Croft, your witness. Silas rose slowly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the feigned emotion from the other side. He walked toward the witness stand, not with aggression, but with a quiet, scholarly air. Mr. Vance, Silas began, his voice mild, you love your mother, don't you? Julian seemed taken aback by the simple question. Yes, of course I do. And everything you've done out of concern for her well-being. Yes, Julian said, a little too quickly. Absolutely. That's admirable, Silas said, nodding. Now, you mentioned your mother's home. It's a beautiful house, isn't it? A valuable piece of property. It's the house I grew up in, Julian said defensively. Indeed. And you feel you have a right to it, don't you? As your inheritance? Their lawyer shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. I'll allow it, the judge said, her eyes narrowed on Julian. Answer the question, Mr. Vance.
Julian squirmed in his seat. I suppose it's my birthright. It was my father's house. I grew up there. I have a right to it. The words tumbled out, a flash of the entitlement that lay beneath the veneer of concern. A right, Silas repeated softly. Interesting choice of words. Not a hope or a future possibility, but a right. Is this sense of right that led you to empty your mother's safe deposit box the day after she left town? The color drained from Julian's face. He shot a panicked look at his lawyer who could do nothing. I was consolidating her documents to keep them safe. To keep them safe, Silas mused, by removing them from a locked vault in a bank and taking them where exactly, Mr. Vance? To our home, to my mother's home. The home you were at that very moment illegally occupying after changing the locks and putting her belongings on the porch? Objection, the lawyer cried out again. Overruled, the judge snapped. Mr. Croft is establishing a pattern of behavior. Silas pressed on, his voice still deceptively gentle. You testified that you were worried about your mother's financial state, that she was letting bills go unpaid. Is that correct? Yes, Julian mumbled. Then perhaps you can explain this. Silas walked to the table and picked up a document. This is an application for a home equity line of credit against the property at 142 Ocean Drive. The application is for $200,000. It was filed 2 weeks ago. The signatures on the application are yours, Ms. Renault's, and a rather clumsy forgery of your mother's. Can you explain how applying for a massive loan against your frail mother's house was an act of protection? Julian was speechless. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. Let me rephrase, Silas said, his voice now turning to ice. Were you protecting your mother, Mr. Vance, or were you attempting to liquidate her primary asset for your own gain and got caught? Julian stared at him, his face a mask of pale, sweaty terror. He knew he was trapped. Silas wasn't finished. He produced another document. This is a sworn affidavit from a loan officer at the bank that rejected your application, citing inconsistent signatures and suspected fraudulent activity. Did you tell your mother about this, Mr. Vance? Did you inform her that her identity was being used in a failed attempt to commit wire fraud? No, he whispered, the word barely audible. No, you did not, Silas confirmed. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, the petitioner has testified that he acted out of love and concern. The evidence shows he acted out of greed and self-interest. He didn't file for conservatorship because his mother was incompetent. He filed because she was in the way. He didn't need a guardian for his mother. He needed to silence the owner of the house he was trying to steal. Silas walked back to our table and sat down. The room was utterly silent, except for the sound of Julian's ragged breathing. Their lawyer looked defeated. Chloe was staring at Julian with a look of pure fury. Her mask of civility had finally shattered. She had hitched her wagon to a coward, and he had crumbled under the first sign of pressure. Judge Hasham looked down at Julian, her expression one of profound disappointment. Mr. Vance, you may step down. He practically fled from the witness stand. The narrative they had so carefully constructed had not just been challenged, it had been utterly demolished. The foundation of their case, built on lies and twisted truths, had just collapsed into dust.
After a brief recess, during which Chloe and her lawyer engaged in a furious whispered argument, the judge reconvened the hearing. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The air of sympathy for the concerned son had evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical scrutiny. Mr. Croft, Judge Hasham said, her gaze now on me, does your client wish to make a statement? She does, Your Honor, Silas replied, and then he sat down, leaving the floor entirely to me. This was it, my moment. All the nights of fear, the hours of research, the painful memories, it all came down to this. I stood up and walked to the witness stand, my steps measured and deliberate. I felt the weight of every eye in the room, but my focus was singular, the judge. I was not there to speak to Julian or Chloe. They were irrelevant now. I was there to speak the truth to the one person who mattered.
After being sworn in, I sat down and folded my hands on the railing in front of me. I looked directly at Judge Haysham. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and strong, resonating in the quiet room. "My name is Eleanor Vance. For the past hour, you have heard a story about a woman who bears my name. You have heard that she is confused, frail, and incompetent. I am here to tell you that woman does not exist." I didn't look at my notes. I didn't need them. I was speaking from a script written over a lifetime. My son has testified that I am forgetful, but I remember the exact interest rate on the 30-year mortgage my husband, Arthur, and I took out on our home in 1985. It was 12.43%. I remember refinancing in 1993 to 7.5%, a move that saved our family thousands of dollars and helped us build the college fund that paid for my son's degree in finance. I saw a flicker of movement from Julian's direction, but I didn't look. I kept my eyes on the judge. He has testified that I am unable to manage my own affairs, but for 40 years, I worked as a legal insurance underwriter. My job every single day was to analyze complex legal and financial documents, to identify risk, to spot discrepancies, and to make multi-thousand-dollar decisions based on my judgment. I managed multi-million-dollar portfolios for my clients. After I retired, I managed my own. I navigated the labyrinthine hospital and insurance billing system during my husband's final, painful illness. A task, I assure you, that requires the mental fortitude of a battlefield general. I paused, letting the words sink in. The management of a home and a family, Your Honor, is not a hobby. It is a full-time, unpaid job that requires the skills of a CEO, a CFO, and a COO. It is the most important job I have ever had, and I have never, for one day, retired from that job. Finally, I allowed my gaze to shift. I looked at my son. He was staring at his hands, his face ashen. The greatest betrayal here is not the theft of my property. It is not the attempt to defraud a bank. It is the attempt to rewrite my history. It is the attempt to take a lifetime of competence, of care, of meticulous management, and twist it into a symptom of disease. They did not file this petition because they believed I was ill. They filed it because they knew I was not. They filed it because a competent, intelligent woman stood in the way of what they wanted. I turned back to Judge Haysham. "They have not brought you evidence of my incompetence, Your Honor. They have brought you evidence of their own greed. They have asked you to strip me of my rights, to take my home, my finances, and my freedom. I am asking you to do something far simpler. I am asking you to see me, to see the woman who has sat in this chair for 72 years, who has paid her bills, managed her life, buried her husband, raised her son, and who stands before you today not as a patient, but as the sole, rightful owner of her life." I finished, my heart pounding, my breath held tight in my chest. The silence in the room was absolute. Judge Haysham looked down at her notes for a long moment, then she looked up, first at Julian and Chloe, then at their lawyer, and finally at me. "In my 10 years on this bench," she said, her voice filled with a quiet authority, "I have rarely seen a petition for conservatorship so utterly devoid of merit and so transparently malicious in its intent. This court is not a tool to be used for financial gain or to settle family disputes." She looked directly at Julian. "Mr. Vance, your actions are not just legally questionable, they are morally reprehensible. You have abused your mother's trust and attempted to use this court to perpetrate a fraud." She picked up her gavel. "The petition for conservatorship is denied with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled. The temporary freeze on Mrs. Vance's assets is immediately lifted. This matter is dismissed." The sound of the gavel striking the wood was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of victory, the sound of my life being handed back to me. The moment the judge's gavel fell, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through our side of the table. Silas gave my hand a firm, congratulatory squeeze. Isabel, who had been sitting in the back of the chamber, came forward, her eyes shining with tears and triumph. Across the room, the atmosphere was funereal. Chloe was gathering her things with sharp, angry movements, refusing to even look at Julian. Their lawyer was shuffling papers into his briefcase, his face a mask of professional defeat.
Julian just sat there, slumped in his chair, a man utterly broken by the public dismantling of his character. As we walked out into the courthouse corridor, their lawyer approached us. "Mr. Croft," he began, "my clients." Silas held up a hand. "Save it. Your clients are lucky Mrs. Vance is a woman of immense grace. Given the evidence of attempted wire fraud and perjury, she would be well within her rights to press criminal charges." The lawyer paled. "What does she want?" "My client will be in touch," Silas said dismissively, and steered me away. We didn't celebrate with champagne or a fancy dinner. My victory wasn't about gloating. It was about restoration. That afternoon in Silas Croft's book-lined office, we planned the final move. "They expect you to move back into the house," Silas said. "They expect a long, awkward period of them moving out, of dividing possessions. They expect you to hold this over their heads for years." "I have no interest in that," I said. The house, once my sanctuary, now felt tainted by their betrayal. The memories were still there, but they were layered over with the ugliness of the past few weeks. I don't want it anymore. A slow smile spread across Silas's face. He had been expecting this. 2 days later, a letter from Silas's office was delivered to Julian and Chloe. It outlined my decision. I was selling the house. They were to vacate the premises within 30 days. All of my possessions were to be moved into a storage unit at their expense.
But there was more. I was not going to press criminal charges for the attempted fraud or the theft from the safe deposit box. My silence, however, came with a condition. It was a condition born not of revenge, but of a need for meaningful justice. They were both required to complete 200 hours of community service to be served at the Port Blossom Center for Elder Care. Specifically, working in the unit for residents with Alzheimer's and dementia. They would have to spend their weekends confronting the reality of the illness they had tried to feign for me. They would have to look into the eyes of people truly suffering from what they had used as a weapon. Failure to complete the service would result in Silas forwarding the entire case file to the district attorney's office. They had no choice but to accept. A week later, Isabel helped me organize a small press conference at her office. It wasn't for the major news networks, but for the local paper and community bloggers. I wanted the story told, but on my terms. I stood before a small group of journalists and announced my final decision. The house at 142 Ocean Drive has been a part of my family's story for over 40 years, I began, my voice steady. But a story must evolve to have meaning. Today, I am announcing that I am selling the property, and 100% of the proceeds from the sale will be used as the seed money for a new foundation. I paused, letting them absorb the news. It will be called the Port Blossom Legacy Foundation. Its mission will be simple: to provide pro bono legal support and emergency financial aid to elderly individuals who are facing financial abuse or fraudulent conservatorship claims from within their own families. It will be a shield for those who find themselves in the battle I have just fought. I announced that Isabel Rosie would serve as the executive director of the foundation, and Silas Croft would oversee the legal compliance board. My personal tragedy was being transformed into a public good. My inheritance, the one Julian was so desperate to claim, would now be used to protect others from sons like him. I wasn't just taking back my house. I was rewriting its legacy. It would no longer just be the house where I raised my son. It would be the house that built a fortress for the vulnerable. I didn't wait for questions. I simply smiled, thanked them for their time, and walked away. The weight I had been carrying for weeks finally lifted. I was no longer a victim in my story. I was the founder. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of logistics. The house sold quickly, its Victorian charm and ocean views making it a coveted property. True to their agreement, Julian and Chloe moved my belongings into a storage unit. I never saw them. All communication was handled through our lawyers. A part of me wondered what they were thinking, what they felt as they packed away the remnants of the life they had tried to steal. I received a single,
terse email from Julian confirming the completion of the move with a scanned copy of the storage unit contract. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what he had done, just the cold finality of a business transaction. I didn't need an apology. His silence was its own confession. I found a new apartment, a small, bright space in a modern building overlooking the marina. It was the polar opposite of my old house, all clean lines, large windows, and morning light. It was a blank canvas, holding no ghosts, no memories, but the ones I chose to make. I carefully unpacked my most treasured possessions: the photo of Arthur, the quilt I had made for Julian as a baby, my books. I found a small table for my reading lamp. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old photographs, I came across the one of Julian's first day of kindergarten. I hadn't noticed it before in the chaos of the eviction. Someone, presumably Chloe, had taken a pair of scissors and neatly trimmed the right edge of the photo. My face had been cleanly cut out, surgically removed. I was no longer in the picture. I stared at the mutilated photograph, at the empty space where my smiling face should have been. A year ago, this would have shattered me. Now, I felt a strange sense of recognition. This was what they had tried to do: edit me out of my own life. I looked at the smiling faces of Arthur and a gap-toothed little Julian, and I felt a pang of sadness for the family we once were. Then, I placed the mutilated picture in a small wooden box, closed the lid, and put it away. People think healing is loud, like thunder, but sometimes it moves like breath, quiet and slow. I never erased them from my memory. I simply chose not to center my life around people who edited me out of theirs. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. I spent my mornings helping Isabel set up the foundation. Our first case was a woman whose daughter had tried to sell her house after getting power of attorney. When I sat with her and heard her story, I knew I had made the right decision. My pain had been forged into a purpose. I started walking by the harbor again, not with a heavy heart of a victim, but with the light step of a survivor. One day, I passed the community service center and saw Julian through the window. He was spoon-feeding an elderly man who was staring blankly into space. He looked tired, diminished. Our eyes met for a brief second. There was no anger in his gaze, no hatred. There was just a vast, empty sadness. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and kept walking.